When I was around 9, my gran gave me this film on VHS. And because I watched it over and over again, it sort of got in my head a little bit. I think, probably like most of us, I enjoyed the story, The Emperor's New Clothes, and it might have shaped how I think about the world. Now, just in that short introduction, I've made a few assumptions, so let's clear them up. I have assumed that you know what a VHS is. If you don't, it's sort of like a big tape thing that we used to store films on, kind of like a DVD. And maybe I'm assuming that you know what a DVD is. It's like a bit of Netflix that's stored on a physical drive. In fact, Netflix used to send them out in the post before they did streaming. Yeah, true fact. But that version of The Emperor's New Clothes you can't get on streaming. It's quite hard to get on DVD, to be honest. You've got to search eBay. But maybe I'm assuming that you're interested or know the story The Emperor's New Clothes. Assumptions are really easy to make. Unlike other forms of invisible information, they can form barriers between us. The version of The Emperor's New Clothes that I watched over and over again was a comedic take. There are these two criminals who have a plan to extort money from the emperor. There's a love story, there's comedy, there's singing. At times there's quite questionable acting. I remember one song in particular about halfway through the film. The criminals have started making these clothes for the emperor, and they've said that only intelligent people can see the clothes. But they don't really exist. This song features the emperor's two key advisors debating over whether the clothes are red or blue. They've both got a favourite colour, and they're convinced that the clothes that don't exist and which no one can see match their preference. In the story, it takes the innocence of a child to burst the bubble and to point out how silly everyone, including the all-powerful emperor, is being. I think I remember watching that film, enjoying the comedy, but thinking, well, this is clearly a farce made for children. This would never happen in the real world. And then I've lived my adult life and I've sat in rooms and I've sort of seen that song re-sung in different voices and at different tempos. Not often with music, but I've seen people with the same certainty advocate for positions made mainly out of bias, prejudice and preference rather than facts and data. And I've also sat in rooms with teams where people have reacted like that emperor in the story, and they've been held back by pride or a lack of confidence and taken things for granted. They haven't asked the questions that they've been dying to know the answer to, like, can anyone else see these clothes? Sometimes the environments that we create for collaboration hold people back. And just like in the story of The Emperor's New Clothes, it takes confidence and curiosity to burst the bubble and get people who might have been blinded by a little too much confidence or a little too little curiosity to ask, what if? Today is about breaking down barriers, and I want to convince you that the most dangerous kind of barriers are the invisible ones. They're the most dangerous because they're difficult to make intentional choices around, because we miss them. We create invisible barriers when we miss something obvious because we don't question it, or when we take something for granted, or when something stops us questioning. It might be a fear of being wrong or being silly. Finding these barriers and either breaking them or navigating up and over them or around them, I think is some of the most valuable work that we can do. So that is our main topic, our big issue. And I guess I want to start by talking about how sometimes talking about the main thing is the most difficult to address. Sometimes talking about that important issue can be difficult and challenging, particularly when there isn't agreement or when it's contentious. Things like what gets into the next sprint or what makes a minimum viable product can be really difficult things to address. But to talk about them is the only way that we can make progress. And sometimes to talk about them, we find ourselves in the zone of uncomfortable debate. At its best, this is a place where we can have constructive dialogue about ideas and resolve differences. But it can be uncomfortable because we might not have enough information, or we might have differences of opinion. That's uncomfortable. And if we don't navigate the zone with skill and intention, it can erode the relationships of trust which make collaboration effective. At other times, even when we know what the big issue is and we know we need to address differences of opinion, we spend time talking about other things. We spend time talking about things that we already agree on and that won't really make progress. This is the zone of comfortable debate. It's where we're talking about things that we already agree on or aren't important to the main issue. In Britain, we might be talking about the weather. So this is a model, and I like it because it gets us thinking about lots of things that are important for collaborative work. The differences in these zones hint at the importance of psychological safety. That's the belief that you won't be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas or questions or concerns or pointing out mistakes. It's something that most of the characters in The Emperor's New Clothes sadly haven't got. This model also hints that the levels of psychological safety can fluctuate through interactions and relationships. That's why I quite like to flatten this out sometimes and create a sort of line or area diagram rather than that circular one. It helps me think about how meetings, projects, relationships can spend different times in different zones. I think that over time we build trust and shared language, and that allows us to spend more time talking about the real issues or addressing and shrinking the area of uncomfort to make progress more quickly. But I also think that sometimes we do need to spend time in our comfort zone, recharging or building relationships and social capital that can be useful for when we're approaching more difficult conversations. I like to use this as a map that helps me think intentionally about a few behaviours. So let's dive into 5 examples now. The investment. This behaviour sees us consciously spend some time around about here, just on the boundary of comfort. We can use small talk and active listening to hear things that matter to people. We can take note of their preferences. How do people think? Do they speak in metaphors? Do they like data and statistics? This is their default style. Spending time here builds trust and insight, and we can use that as we enter more uncomfortable interactions. Talking of which, you are here markers. When you've entered the zone of discomfort, identify it. This initial awkwardness will feel hard, but usually it will make the discussion more fruitful. We can use process moves, which is something I'll talk about later, to identify where we are in a conversation. Saying things like, "I'm feeling tense," highlights where you are emotionally and can humanise the moment and break barriers. Bridging to the issue. This forms a smoother transition between the zones. Saying things like, "This conversation might get difficult," can sometimes help. Occasionally, it might backfire as it primes for a certain type of interaction and might spark a fight or flight response, which I'll talk about later. But if you've got trust, it's usually helpful rather than disruptive. And by identifying and calling out that there might be differences of opinion, it moves them into the light so that they're easier to address and people can spend more time on the issue rather than trying to pass the subtext. The retreat happens when we go back to the comfort zone without making a decision. This can go on for a long time in teams and means that real issues are never addressed and progress never really happens. So this can be unhelpful, but you might be able to transform a retreat into a ping pong. The ping pong. This occurs when people intentionally move back and forth so they can recharge. Later, I'll talk a little bit about techniques from negotiation. Summarising can be one form of ping pong. It takes stock of where we are, returning people to a moment of safety before returning to points of contention. You can create moments when everybody enjoys the recharging effect of the comfort zone and builds more rapport and trust within the group, and then have another go at the uncomfortable thing, trying to get to the main issue. So, those behaviours might be useful. They're what we can use when we're navigating the zone, and they provide labels for some behaviours that we might see in others or which we can try to cultivate in ourselves. But how do you actually do them practically? The most important skill in overcoming assumptions, confusion, ambiguity and other types of invisible barrier is usually doing it authentically, sharing your own perspective to contribute to the group. You're there for a reason, and by making a contribution you will usually move things forward. But there are a range of styles that you might like to adopt when you find yourself in this type of difficult conversation or uncomfortable space. I'm going to touch quickly on 3 approaches. Now obviously we haven't got very long, so take these more as quick introductions and book recommendations rather than definitive exploration of an idea. But there are different approaches that we can take when we find ourselves in uncomfortable conversations. I'm going to talk about 3. One focused on questions, one focused on clarifying, and one focused on negotiation. I hope that by sharing a few, you'll find ways that work best for you. And actually, thinking of these as building blocks might help you be more successful and remain authentic. This section is about the difference between inquiry and advocacy. Let's take a moment to think about how you respond when someone is talking. What do you do when someone is talking? Are you listening and waiting for your turn to speak? What do you do when someone asks a question? How often do you ask questions? I think questions are a superpower. Even rhetorical questions can get us all thinking about the possibilities ahead. In The Emperor's New Clothes, the king is humiliated because he has no humility and he doesn't ask the right questions. He really doesn't ask any questions at all. This can happen to all of us when we're sure of our expertise or convinced of our position, or when we're under pressure. Pressure tends to create a fight or flight response in us, and that literally shrinks the options that we perceive. And we also have a whole heap of cognitive biases which can combine to shrink that potential that we see in situations and form invisible barriers that stand between us and other people. This is how most of us make sense of the world. Prior experience forms expectation, which filters the data we receive. We see and hear more or less what we expect, based on prior experience, or more importantly, on what we hope to achieve. Then we react. And there's growing evidence that emotional response may actually occur before or at the same time as observation. People show fear physically before they perceive the threat. It's essential for us to be able to know what we are feeling, both to avoid bias in responding and to use feelings to help us diagnose the situations we find ourselves in. If we are feeling tense, a meeting will feel tense. If we're feeling defensive, we might compromise our ability to listen and respond. Judgment and then action are only as valid as the data it's based on. So we need to minimize distortions in input. But one way of minimizing this filtering and short-circuiting effect And breaking down the barriers they create is by adopting a more curious and humble position as we collaborate. So we need to understand two things then, right? Humility and inquiry. Let's start with humility. There are a few different types of humility, and depending on our role in a team or in an organisation, we might need to flex how we adopt a position of humility. There's basic humility. That's where humility isn't really a choice, but it's an arbitrary condition, like our status in an organisation or our position. Then there's optional humility. This is when we feel humble in the presence of people who have achieved great things or are experts in their own field. And now there's here and now humility, which occurs when I am dependent on you for something. Collaboration creates interdependence. So humility should be something that you can adopt in a team, even if you're leading it. Combining humility with inquiry maximizes our curiosity, and that's a superpower because it minimizes our bias and preconceptions and genuinely opens us up to collaboration. It shuts down the fight and flight responses that we might feel when we're challenged or questioned and allows us to access our ignorance and accept it. Now, just like humility, there are different types of inquiry. But when we add humility into them, all of them become more effective. Diagnostic inquiry is when I'm curious, but with a specific focus or agenda. I steer and influence the other person. There can be a number of different diagnostic focus points. I might be interested in feelings and reactions, which allows me to focus the other person on their feelings, which they might not have considered or felt were part of the situation. I can talk about causes and motives, which allows people to talk about their interpretation or analysis of the intention that's driving behaviour. I can ask action-oriented questions, which ask why they did a thing or what they're planning to do in the future. This convergent style of questioning asks people to focus, so it's good for initiating action. And I can ask systematic questions which build up a picture of the entire situation, combining all of those different types of question to increase the amount of information I have available to me. Confrontational inquiry sees me insert my own ideas in the form of questions. Rhetorical questions and leading questions can fall into this bracket. They may still be based on inquiry, but it's now in connection with my own interests. I want information, so I direct the questions to get that information. I might ask questions like, did that not make you angry? Or do you think they sat that way because they were scared? Or why didn't you say something? Or were the other people surprised? Process-oriented inquiry might also be called process moves. It's asking about the conversation or the inquiry itself. For example, did I offend you? Or is it okay to talk about this stuff today? You can use different forms of process inquiry. Compare diagnostic process inquiry. What should I be asking you now? Versus confrontational process inquiry. Why has what I've said upset you? Versus humble process inquiry. What's happening in this conversation? Process inquiry is really useful in feedback conversations, which is what I'm going to talk about next. But I think adding a little slice of humility to every form of inquiry makes it more effective, and it improves your chances of navigating the zone of uncomfortable debate. Sadly, there are things which make it more difficult to make the zone more comfortable. We tend to live in a culture of telling. Especially as an expectation of leaders, people are uncomfortable because we take away their autonomy when we tell them things, rather than inviting their own autonomy and mastery to increase their performance and happiness. Teams which only value task completion tend to be quite bad at inquiry and humility. And rules of deference and demeanour associated with rank and position in very hierarchical organisations can also make this more difficult. These features of work make things more uncomfortable and make humble inquiry more difficult. We see all these things in the story The Emperor's New Clothes, and we often see it in collaboration, as people are more interested in being right and getting their own way than establishing and driving towards a common purpose and shared success. Too many conversations and collaborations see us retreat into our own preferences and perspectives. But getting the balance right between our own self-interest and the valuable input that others can make to collaboration is vital. It's the secret to effective collaboration. So let's explore that.
Am I stupid?
By Jove!
Surely not.
Heavens!
I've got this far. But if I am, it's best to stay a secret. Am I unfit for office? No, that's impossible. It can't be. I invented all my offices.
There are lots of reasons why we can fall into the trap of advocacy and miss the chance to improve collaboration. Sometimes we're so certain of our solution that we fail to recognise a better one, even if it's right in front of us. Situations can conspire to create barriers that obscure possibilities. Some of the barriers occur when we find ourselves in crucial conversations. These are conversations when the stakes are high, when we feel like there's something to be won or lost. In some ways, the criminals in The Emperor's New Clothes make every conversation a crucial conversation because they engineer a situation where people are protecting their pride or their position. Different people react differently in these situations, but the zone of uncomfortable debate is full of these types of heightened conversations where emotional engagement might spark a fight or flight response, and it makes acting rationally more difficult. We evolved fight or flight to keep us safe when we're threatened. And now our brains are tricked into feeling threatened when our opinions, expertise, or perspective is questioned. This can happen in all sorts of interactions, especially when we're working collaboratively. But feedback conversations can be particularly tricky because there are invisible barriers that make sharing information more difficult. When someone gives us feedback, it's easy for us to be operating in two separate worlds. I understand my thoughts and my feelings and my intentions, but the other person only sees my behaviour and the impact on them. From this, they create their story about me. Their feedback is all about their world, but I compare that to my world, to my intent, and if they don't match, I can feel threatened, confused, angry, and under pressure. According to the authors of Crucial Conversations, there are 6 styles that people show when they're under stress. Masking consists of understanding or selectively showing our true opinions. Sarcasm or sugarcoating or couching some of what we say are some of the most popular forms of masking. Avoiding involves steering completely away from the sensitive subject. We talk, but without really addressing any of the issues. Withdrawing means pulling out of the conversation altogether. We either exit the conversation or exit the room. These three styles tend to lead us away from the main issue and towards the zone of comfortable debate. They make meaningful collaboration harder because they stop us sharing information. The other three styles heighten the tension in the zone of uncomfortable debate and make it more uncomfortable. That makes progress less likely. Controlling consists of coercing others into your way of thinking. It's done through either forcing your views on them or dominating the conversation. Methods include cutting other people off, overstating facts, speaking in absolutes, changing the subject, or using directive questions to control the conversation. Labelling is putting a label on ideas so that we can dismiss them under general stereotypes. Now, I'm going to talk about a good form of labelling in the next section, but it's important to know that some people can use labels as a weapon. And finally, attacking. You've moved from winning the argument to making the person suffer. Tactics include belittling or threatening. All of these three styles can make the zone of uncomfortable debate more uncomfortable and less effective. So, how do you avoid those behaviours and cope when you bump into them in collaboration? Well, I find it useful to take a moment and to think about where I am in a conversation or collaboration. Do we have a shared purpose? Do we have a relationship of trust? Do we have a shared language so that we can communicate effectively? Do I understand what the other person wants and needs? The key to overcoming invisible barriers is usually the secret to good design. In the early stages, try to frame things as hypotheses rather than assumptions. Don't assume, use negotiation to test your hypotheses. Uncover as much information as possible. Don't prepare a counter-argument, spend time listening. Try to help people feel safe, to help them open up and contribute. Cultivate empathy. Imagine yourself in the collaborator's situation, recognise their perspective, and then vocalise and demonstrate that you've recognised it. Ask questions, then mirror the response, then paraphrase their response to check you've fully understood it. Listen out for people expressing feelings and hear what's fueling those feelings. Focus your attention on identifying emotional obstacles that are standing in the way of an agreement. This might mean analysing people's words, tone and body language and looking for times of incongruence when they're saying one thing but their tone or body is saying another thing. You want to remind collaborators that you share a problem. So rather than retreating to different sides of the problem, you can encircle it using your own perspective and your own expertise to solve it together. That doesn't mean compromising. It means working as hard as you can to find the win-win in every collaboration where everyone wins and you solve the problem together. And that takes us into the final set of behaviours which are focused on negotiation. So, I've talked about humble inquiry to help us get the balance right between talking and listening. And we've used active listening and our communication skills to get information, build intimacy, express our own expertise and perspective, and show our commitment to a common goal and purpose. But how do we make sure that we get what we need from a collaboration? Especially when we find ourselves in the zone of uncomfortable debate and things get heated or people retreat into their own self-interest rather than the shared common interest. I think we can approach it as a negotiation. And one of the best ways of approaching negotiation that I've come across is from this book. So I want to end by sharing a few ideas from this. The first is the extension of what I've just been talking about. It's a heightened awareness of what other people need and using this to build empathy to make progress. Quite often in the zone of uncomfortable debate, we are faced with a barrage of barriers and negative responses that we need to resolve to make progress. We need to be able to neutralize the negatives, but we shouldn't avoid them. Avoiding negatives is actually counterproductive effect on trust and influence. It's just an example of being in the zone of comfortable debate and ignoring things. We don't make progress there. So we extend those communication skills into negotiation. It might sound counterintuitive, but encourage people in the zone of uncomfortable debate to say no. Saying no makes people feel less uncomfortable sometimes. It's got to be the right kind of no. But giving someone the right to say no can help preserve their autonomy and their sense of control in a situation. So while it might feel a little bit uncomfortable, try to ask no-oriented questions. Compare, is this a good idea, to, is this a ridiculous idea? It gives the person more control and might build more empathy and trust. Being asked to say yes too soon in a negotiation makes people defensive. So use no responses to mark out the boundary to what is making the collaboration uncomfortable. When you receive no responses, it gives you something to navigate round. You can use that to explore the problem together and create a shared problem. What about this doesn't work for you? What would you need to make this work? It seems like there's something here that bothers you. The zone of uncomfortable debate is sometimes the only way to navigate disagreement so that we can make progress and get to the big issue. So we don't want to stay getting no responses, but we want to be careful about the yes responses that we get. Chris Voss says there are 3 types of yes. Yeah. This is a counterfeit yes. It's used as an escape route. They want to say no, but they feel as though they can't. Yeah. This is a confirmation yes. It's a reflexive response to a question. It's an empty affirmation. There's no promise of action. Yes, that's right. This is true agreement and it will lead to action. The best type of yes usually isn't a yes on its own. It's a yes, that's right. That's right represents wholehearted agreement. It's focused on the idea, the big issue, rather than the person. So it's much better than a you're right. That's usually a sign that there is still difference or distance between people. Steps for triggering a that's right include effective pauses. Encourage your counterpart to keep talking. Minimal encouragers like, yeah, okay. It shows that you're paying attention and keeps people talking. Listen and then repeat back what you've heard. Label, give feelings a name and then you can deal with them. But remember to take out the judgment. Repeat in your own words what your counterpart has said and demonstrate understanding. And then re-articulate that so that you show that you acknowledge the underlying emotions and the needs in a summary. Talking of a summary, let's do that now. Invisible barriers make things harder, but they often do it in a way that is difficult to spot, so they can be really demoralizing. Removing them increases efficiency and gives you more energy to do things you want to do. But a couple of things that I haven't mentioned. Because invisible barriers are harder to spot, overcoming them might be a source of competitive advantage because other people and other organisations are more likely to have missed them too. And finally, invisible barriers are often the result of unconscious bias and prejudice. So there is a social justice benefit to improving the way that you think about them and overcome them. Throughout the this talk, I've been advocating for the need to enter the zone of uncomfortable debate, and I've tried to arm you with some tools, techniques, models and ideas that might make your time in that zone more effective, even if it's not much more comfortable. There will always be zones of uncomfortable debate in any collaboration, but I think you can navigate them more successfully with these techniques. I also think that one or two of them might enable you to shrink that zone so that you can more quickly jump to the main issue. The secret main issue in this talk has really been about building trust. This is the trust equation. It describes the building blocks of trust. Unfortunately, I've given you all the tools you need to build this equation for yourself. Humble inquiry helps you to balance all the elements in this equation. It avoids you pushing too hard with self-interest, and it increases your ability to have meaningful interactions with other people. Crucial Conversations gives you the tools to build intimacy and credibility, and getting the balance right between listening, speaking and acting builds reliability. Using some of the techniques from negotiation reinforces this, and it ensures that you don't forget your own self-interest, whether that's advocating for the user or pushing business goals, or whether it's just creating space to explain and expand your ideas alongside those of the other people in your team. So that might be the lesson of this whole talk. If you want to collaborate, then you must build relationships of trust. Because when we've got relationships of trust, there'll always be someone around to stop us making horrible mistakes, like the emperor in that story. Thanks for listening.
Only the people who are fit for their jobs and smart will be able to see these clothes. I think this will be very good for the kingdom, for it will weed out all those people who are trying to bluff their way through life. Good day to you all.
Papa, is that possible?
Nothing's impossible. Keep cheering.